Okay, are there any questions left over from last time that I can answer first of all? If you came in late and you need your exam, you can pick it up after class. I've still got a few. Okay, well, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in where I left off last time. We were talking about different features of Thomas More's Utopia and thinking about them, what their purpose is, whether they actually fulfill that purpose or not. One of the things that More talks about a lot is farming, and how farming is done there is very different. And I think we left off last time with his idea that they farm in sort of larger, what we might call now communes, but he didn't use that word. He used the word families, but they're families of people who aren't necessarily related by genetics, but they're families because they're all living in one place, all working in the same way. And actually in the cities they have such families as well. So families or units like that are organized around the work that they do and not around heredity. And so we talked a little bit about how that type of farming, where people live in larger groups and do it together, has some benefits and some drawbacks. We talked about how Moore thinks that city people ought to rotate into this type of job for at least 2 years so that they get the experience of farming. And we talked a little bit about the usefulness of that, erasing the class distinctions, which seems to be his aim. But maybe the drawback of it would be less efficiency. I think that was brought up last time, that some of you were concerned that maybe that type of farming would be a little less efficient, because when you rotate people in and out a lot, and when you have a certain percentage of people who really have a steep learning curve, so to speak, people who have been working in the city in a trade, don't know anything about farming, coming into that situation, it would seem like they would slow the process down. But perhaps there's so many people involved, and there is a core there, apparently, that continues to live on those farms, because as Moore says, not everybody will want to do that, and those who do want to do that and are happier living in the countryside, some of them can choose to stay for their entire career, so to speak. Now, Moore believes that this type of production, which is done collectively and with the aim of just feeding people, so they're growing things that are needed for food mainly, not for clothing. They do have cotton clothing, so there would be some cotton growing, but there's not going to be a lot of growing of things that are not necessary for life, okay? They will have a surplus of agricultural goods in his view, so much of a surplus, okay, that they will be able to actually give the rest away. What they don't use in any given year, they will be able to give away instead of trading, okay? Now, why wouldn't they try to make some extra money to, maybe deal with the people on the continent, have some money so that they could deal with them and buy things that they need from them, okay? Why don't they just sell it? Why do they give it away? Do you get a feeling as to why they just simply give it away? Does that make sense? And it's not something that people do, right? They don't tend to give anything away, especially something this desirable or important. And the way that he explains it is that this creates good relations with their neighbors, that their neighbors will see them as an asset, not something to get rid of or not somebody to fight with, but rather an asset because they get free food from them, free goods from them. Do you think that would work? Is that a good method of diplomacy? Huh? Uh-huh.
Well, Machiavelli says, you want to be careful not to be too generous, because when people start expecting it, and they might have an enslaved world.
Yeah. It depends on human nature, doesn't it? I mean, it depends on what you think of human nature. If people are like Machiavelli suggests, then they're going to say, hey, we're getting this little bit now, but we could get a lot more if we actually possess this land, which appears to be fertile and controlled. So it's not necessarily the case that that people will jump to the right conclusion, in other words. Moore is assuming a high degree of rationality here. And of course, he knows that the real world is not always so rational. But he's trying to point our attention always to, what if we could be more enlightened? What if people could be more rational and really act in their self-interest more of the time, in their true self-interest, right? But the truth is, you never know what's going to happen. Sometimes, like you say, when you give people something, they simply want more. It inflames their desires for more, okay? They may not need what you're offering, and they may need something else more. So there's an assumption here that if you give people things and you share and you're generous, that generosity will be reciprocated, okay? And I'm just saying that that's a disputable assumption. It's an assumption that, as you rightly point out, Machiavelli would dispute. It doesn't mean that it's wrong or that it's not right some of the time, okay? And it shouldn't surprise you that somebody like Thomas More would make this assumption or want to make it because of his Christian background, okay? He's trying to depict a world in which people do the right thing, right? So, by the way, they don't need the money, right? What if they don't have money, okay? So in this system, the government wants to discourage this type of activity where people profit somehow from whatever they do, okay? So if farmers could sell their excess goods and get money, they'd be the only people with money in the system. Or if the government did it, the government would then have money and be able to use that money to get what it wants, right? Somebody would be controlling that money and and then they would start to trade with the people on the mainland and obtain what they want, creating a difference in the amount of wealth that somebody has, okay? So in order to get away from that, you have to get rid of money. There is no money on Utopia, and that would be one source of money, so he doesn't want that. Instead, he says that when it comes to the way that they get things for themselves in Utopia, they do not trade in any way, okay? Sometimes in a non-monetary system, you, in effect, still have a lot of trade, right? Through barter. You say, well, I'll give you this bundle of cotton, and you give me this bushel of grain. We'll call it even. You get what you want, I get what I want. There isn't even that. There's no bartering or trade going on. Instead, everybody produces what they can, and it all ends up in central storehouses, okay? And from those central storehouses, it is distributed. And More says, or Raphael says, there is no need for controlling how it is distributed, okay? In other words, there's no need of giving people quotas and saying, well, you can only have this much cloth, okay, this year. Because people will not take more than they need. They have no incentive to do so, all right? Now, if you were in this type of situation, would you do that? Would you just take what you thought you needed for that year?
It seems like there's probably a big difference between what people need and what they want. I think people would mostly take more. And even if that weren't the case and they were actually taking what they needed, I bet a lot of people would, think, well, maybe next year won't be as good. Maybe I should start saving up.
Right? There's always that human behavior of hedging, of sort of saying, hey, I'm not sure if this is going to be enough. I better take more. I better keep some aside.
I think it depends on how much confidence they have in their system.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Right. If they had experienced success for many years and they really had the confidence, the comfort level, that would make a difference, wouldn't it? I think that's what More is thinking, is that, we live in a society, even our own, which is greatly more wealthy than More's England. We live in a society where we think in terms of always protecting ourselves against possible loss, right? So we do things like that. If you took this group of people and put them into that situation, okay, I think what would happen is hoarding, which often happened in communist countries when goods were distributed. If there was any way that some people could get more, they would do as much of that as they possibly could. They hoarded because that way they would protect themselves against the future. Because in their experience, the next year, as you say, might not be very good. All right? But if you had lived in a system, and this is an if, okay, and this is what Moore is asking us to imagine, if you had lived in a system where year after year you actually were provided for, and where having excess goods became more like a burden, where are you going to put them, okay? What are you going to do with them? And you really felt comfortable, perhaps you wouldn't make those mental calculations. This is something that Marx asks us to consider as well. If you live in a system that actually takes care of you and that you can count on. Now, the one thing that you can't count on, or that no government can guarantee, is against natural disaster. And I think somebody mentioned that before, actually last week. And surely there will be times when the crops won't be as good because there wasn't enough rain, or something happened, floods, something that prevented the crops from doing as well, that people would have an experience of. So I think it's just something to think about. How would this work, and what are Moore's expectations? Okay, what does he expect for people to feel this comfortable? Okay, that if people hoard, then there will be scarcity, and then there will be conflict. That if people can actually simply take what they need, then there will be enough for all. And this is his message, I think, for England, is that there's people who are hoarding, and wait, not just because of felt need, or because they imagine themselves to someday be needing it, but because they're excessively wealthy and they just want more for the sake of having it. Okay, so he's drawing attention back to his own situation and saying, hey, look, if everybody just took what they needed, no one would be poor. That's his overall point. Okay. Now, he does talk about how men and women both will have trade. Every person who have a trade, every person who can work will work, all right, at doing something. And men's trades involve, heavier work, because he does acknowledge a difference between men and women as far as their physical strength. But interestingly, women, too, are asked to have a trade. Now, their first occupation, as you'll find out, is still to be mothers, still to take care of their family, because the family is not completely communized in this system, as it was in Plato's Republic, at least for the top classes. Okay? But nevertheless, you can imagine that in families of 40 or 50 people, that there would be cooperation in the raising of children. And apparently the women will have time to also practice a trade. They're the ones who make the clothes, for instance, that everybody wears, that puts that together. They do the cooking, and these people eat in communal meals, so the women would be working together to provide those meals. They make pottery and so forth. So everybody is expected to be productive. Okay? And we'll talk more about men and women in a little while, because it's, Moore has some what we might think of as progressive proposals, and then he's got some proposals that seem pretty traditional and old-fashioned alongside them, so he's interesting. As far as how they live, as the video pointed out, he's very big on uniformity. The buildings are all basically the same. And when you walk down the street, it's like, suburbia, That's how I imagine it. Those streets in suburbs that, you really can't hardly distinguish one house from the other. Actually, what's that place up north here? Colonial, not that far north. I mean in Manhattan. Williamsburg, I think it's called. Anyway, there's a little subdivision here in Manhattan. I know somebody who lives there. And all the houses in this case are made of brick. And I go in there, and if I don't have his address really handy, I can't recognize his house from any of the other ones. They all look exactly the same. They have about the same amount of yard space. They have the same design. And now, to me, that's a little bit too much sameness. I wouldn't want to be, tired and go into my neighborhood at night and forget where my house is. And I imagine that, in fact, I think he told me that happened when they first moved in a couple of times. They had a hard time, finding their own home. What would, thinking like Moore, what would be good about having the dwelling places that people live in looking and being designed basically the same?
Maybe people wouldn't get jealous of one another for having a preferable arrangement.
Okay, there's definitely that, right. So nobody will be living in a bigger house or a fancier house, or even just a different house that other people might admire more than their own. They wouldn't be able to distinguish amongst themselves in that way. So that's a major benefit, and Moore always has that in mind. Now, is it or is it not true that people do this? They make distinctions on the basis of how big their house is and what it looks like on the inside and outside and so forth. So, and sometimes it causes hurt feelings. My parents, they live in a sort of middle class house, kind of like I do, only a little bit smaller. There's just two of them. And yet they have friends who live in much bigger, homes that they go to church with, and they go and they visit them. And sometimes my mom says, I don't know if I want to invite them to my house. It's so small, It just doesn't have all that stuff going on in it, and she's kind of uncomfortable. Now, I don't think that they would care. I really don't. And when they've had their friends to their home, it doesn't seem like they do care. But there's still this worry, okay? Does that sound familiar? Okay. I'm sure you guys come from all different, backgrounds, and some of you came from big, big houses and some from small homes. But there's this sort of worry of, can I really interact with that person? Because they have higher expectations than I can fulfill. Okay, so it does tend to put people in an uncomfortable position sometimes, where they're not sure whether they're the same social class, right? Simply because they see the house, and the house sort of defines the class. And then they think, is it really appropriate? What's this person going to think? I have a friend who lives in a really big house, one of my best friends, but and she drives a Lexus or Mercedes or whatever she's driving now. She has a really nice car. And I actually, when I take her out, I go and I make sure my car is really clean. Every once in a while, I go and pick her up instead of the other way around. So what do? I wash off the car. I make sure it's got a good wax job, because my car's 9 years old. Okay, I could afford a better car, but I don't want a better car. My car's 9 years old, and I'm going to drive until it dies, because that's the way I am. And so I clean out the interior, I vacuum everything, because I don't want her to be grossed out by my car. All right? So it's these little things, Now, if I was a little bit more sensitive, I'd probably say I can't be her friend, because we just live so differently. But lucky for me, I don't think like that. I try not to think like that. But it does make me a little uncomfortable, because she's used to a lot nicer surroundings than what I can provide. Okay? So there's that. Is there any other reason why you would want to build the buildings to have the same design? Because he says the outside's the same, the courtyard's the same, they're very close together too. Built right one on top of each other. Is there any benefit design-wise or maintenance-wise? That type of plan?
Anything were to happen in the house, like something broke or just didn't work, and you're getting more between all those things, everything stockpiles, spare parts.
Right, major benefit, right. Much easier to repair if they all use the same plumbing, if they all have the same components, right? You can just, you can make one set, basically, and you put it in storage, and whenever something breaks, you go right to where you need to be. You don't have to hunt down parts, you don't have to make new things to fit and so forth. So they're much easier to maintain, and that's a big point he makes. And anything that's easier to maintain causes you to work less, okay? And one of the big points about Utopia is working less, all right? If people only produce what they need and live modestly and design things so that you can keep them for a long time instead of rebuilding, okay? Then you're going to work less overall as a society. You'll have more time for other things. For much the same reasons as we just discussed with the buildings being uniform, people also wear about the same clothes, and they're, as the video said, rather austere or plain. Okay? There's no ornamentation on the clothes or jewelry. Adults don't wear jewelry. They do use the clothes to distinguish between the sexes and between those who are married and unmarried, so that people know in the, to facilitate men and women getting together and marrying, so that people know who's single and who isn't, so to speak. Okay? So supposedly this is useful, but otherwise they don't have the choice. You wouldn't have the choice to say, okay, I'd like to wear blue today, okay? Or I'd like to wear purple, or I'll put on these earrings, because none of that is allowed. You're going to be wearing the same thing. Now again, are there benefits to that? Other than, obviously one benefit is the lack of distinctions. Any other benefits that you can think? Right, but again, it saves time, because there's, one type of design for, well, 4 types of design, basically, but for clothes. All right, very few designs have to be made. People will get very good at making them. Okay, so there's that. Would you be happy with that? Does it make sense to you that maybe people would be happier if they didn't wear all sorts of different clothes and have different levels of gear? Some people wear a lot of money on themselves, right? Like, $500, and other people don't, right? Yeah.
Well, I think some people will be comforted by the fact that they wouldn't be judged on what they're wearing, simply because they wouldn't have to, wear something that would, say, oh, I have a lot of money, or, this, that, or the other. So for some people, it would be nice to keep things really simple and just, A or B, they did that.
Yeah, you wouldn't have to worry anymore about that, right? Every day, many of us get up and we think about how do we look, and how is that, however we look, going to convey us to the outside world. And this is especially difficult, I think, with younger people, younger than you guys, who can catch a lot of crap from their fellow kids if they don't look right, right? If they can't afford the latest, or their parents won't let them have it. Yeah.
It can also be a safety thing, because these days where gang members wear certain clothing, that if you're not wearing that, you get shot or something like that. So it can also be a safety thing.
Yeah, and even if you're not worried about gangs, wearing expensive stuff makes you a target for robbery, definitely, right? So absolutely. In this type of system, there wouldn't be any sort of their desires wouldn't be inflamed in that way. They wouldn't think, I want to have what this other person has, because there would be no difference. Okay. On the other hand, it kind of makes Americans in particular uncomfortable to think about not being able to express themselves. Are clothes a form of expression? Yeah? Would you consider what you wear potentially a form of free speech? Okay. Sometimes what you wear actually expresses your political point of view, or some point that you want to make, right, about yourself and your way you want to live or what you think. So, we're never going to go there. We do have schools, however, that have kids in uniform for the types of reasons we've just discussed, so that they don't attempt to rob and kill each other over clothing, or just persecute each other because some can afford more than others. And, of course, there's a debate about whether that's appropriate, too. But they don't wear jewelry at all, he says, except the children. Why would they allow the children to wear jewelry? They say they find shells and things like that, and they string beads together, and they let the kids adorn themselves with jewelry, but when they become adults, they can't do it anymore. Why is it okay for children to do it? It would seem like, from my experience, the children are the ones that you wouldn't want doing it.
Maybe to allow the kids to have some sort of creativity and express themselves.
Okay.
And be able to make something for themselves and be proud of it.
To be able to just make something and play, right? So they don't want to come down on children too hard when they're small and tell them they have to be exactly like the adults. Yeah.
It also makes orientation a childish institution, so when you become an adult, that's something that you want to get past.
Yeah, there's a little bit of psychology involved here. Right. If children wear it, and that's a big thing for them, then it's kind of like playing with toys. When you become an adult, you don't play with toys anymore. When you become an adult, you look at jewelry as a childish thing, baubles or playthings, right? So he does state that as a reason. Okay? It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with children. It's just it's a way of expressing that mature people are not supposed to care about those things. Okay? So they use jewelry in that way. What about gold? He says that they use gold for chamber pots, first of all. Does everybody know what a chamber pot is? Yeah.
Just what holds the pot in the fire.
Nope. Okay, there's a good reason to explain this. I'll explain it. It's okay. People at this time used to go in chamber pots. Okay, so if you didn't have, none of them would have had, the type of plumbing that we have today, and so they'd have chamber pot by their bed, and this is what they go in. Anybody seen The Madness of King George? You never seen that movie? Oh, well, you would know what a chamber pot was if you'd seen that movie. King George went crazy, of course, at a certain point, several times during his reign. He's the guy that we split from when we became our own separate country. And he lost control of his faculties and his physical abilities. And they have these guys running around with a chamber pot to make sure that, he didn't have an accident. Anyway, so it'd be kind of like if we made our toilets out of gold. Okay? Now, why would you make your toilet out of gold? Yeah.
Just to express the insignificance of gold, like that it doesn't hold any value.
Right. Just to say to people, this is a lowly material. What other people on the mainland consider to be what they seek for the most, supposedly, we're going to treat as though it's just the most lowly of materials. Yeah.
Could it also be that it's one of the easiest things to work with, so that means it saves labor and goes back to the less work and more free time?
Yeah, it's soft, right? And so it's easier to work with, absolutely. And that may be why he says that it provides chains for slaves, too. They make their chains out of gold, which could be easily broken. And we'll be talking about slavery in Utopia pretty soon, because it's really it's an odd institution for such a city to have that aims at justice and equality and so forth. But he does say that slaves wear gold chains. That would be very easy for them to escape from, which implies that maybe most of them don't want to escape, strangely enough. Okay? And it also says, again, you're putting gold onto somebody who has lower status in the society. So again, it would be saying to other people, gold is unimportant. So what is valued by others is treated like clay or, some very readily available material. Okay? We've already talked about this, but repairing their houses saves a lot of labor. He says that new houses are hardly ever built. Okay? It takes a lot more labor to make a house than to keep it going. Okay? All right. Now, here's a great description. They do live in these families of 40 people built around trades. And he describes their workday on page 34. Sort of in the middle of page 34. He says, they divide the day and night into 24 hours. Appoint 6 of these for work. How would you like that? 6-hour workday. Sound pretty good? Yeah. 3 of which are before dinner and 3 after. And the dinner is lunch. Okay? Old-fashioned way of putting it. And then they sup. And at 8 o'clock, counting from noon, they go to bed and sleep 8 hours. The rest of their time, besides taken up in work, eating and sleeping, is left to every man's discretion. Yet they are not to abuse that interval to luxury and idleness, but must employ it in some proper exercise according to their various inclinations, which is, for the most part, reading. Okay, now think about that. All right. This sounds pretty good as far as you don't have to work all that hard. 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon. You could get done with work at, depending on when you got up and when you did the rest of it, about 3 o'clock. Okay? Then you'd have the rest of your day, except for when you were eating supper, to do what you wanted to. But he says, that for most of them, they're discouraged from employing their time in idle pursuits, like I guess would be, he will talk about this in a bit, but game playing of, sort of mindless things. And they're encouraged to engage in something that will improve themselves. So he mentions reading, okay? What was your reaction to just this sort of redirection of people's activity? Right? If people were given 6-hour work days, would they, in our society, spend more time reading, do you think? Okay, what would they spend more time doing?
Watching TV.
What's that?
Watching TV.
Okay, watching TV, since we have TVs. And they're readily available, right? So you might spend a few more hours sitting in front of the TV. Anybody else have any venture a guess as to what people would do with that time? Getting on the internet.
Shopping.
Yeah. Ooh, shopping. Yeah. Of course, we live in a very different society. Shopping would not be available. I suspect if Moore knew what the internet was, he'd probably want to cut it off, as well as television. So he banned them from Utopia because people have to be encouraged to improve their minds, and he's pretty old-fashioned about how that's done, right? But it isn't necessarily the case that we automatically leap to the most productive use of our time, okay? But it would require a society that, as I'm trying to emphasize, encouraging. Obviously, this is a society that tries to shape people's preferences and behavior a little bit. Okay? Because if left alone, a lot of people from England at this time, they didn't have TV and internet, but, if there was a local tavern, I don't think, he doesn't mention alcohol, really. I don't think he does he? Anyway, if there's a local tavern, that's where they'd end up. They'd go there for a few hours and, play cards and have a few beers and enjoy each other's company. Okay? Probably more than they would think about reading. If you just took ordinary average people out of their environment and said, here you go, what do you do with your extra time? Okay? But in Utopia, they are shaped in this direction. So he says it is ordinary to have public lectures every morning before daybreak, at which none are obliged to appear, but those who are marked for literature. Okay, so there are some who will be sort of appointed the task of writing and literature, and for those people, those lectures are required. But for the rest, it's voluntary. So they do have the opportunity to go to public lectures. And then he says, yet a great many, both men and women of all ranks, go to hear lectures of one sort or another according to their inclinations. But if others that are not made for contemplation choose rather to employ themselves at that time and their trades, as many of them do, they are not hindered, but are rather commended, as men that take care to serve their country. Okay? So they have the choice to work more at their trades, and some of them do that. Many of them do that. Okay? They get up a little earlier, and they go, and they start work a little bit earlier. They're required to work 6 hours, but some of them work more than that. Okay? How possible do you think that is? Do you think people would work more than they were required under any circumstances? It's kind of hard to imagine, isn't it? Okay? Marx also believes that in his communist system, people oftentimes will be motivated intrinsically to work more than they might feel like they're required to. Okay? So there's a little bit of similarity there, but there's a big difference too, because Moore believes that the better use of your time, really the superior use, is in learning, not in doing extra work. But there are some people who, as he says, are not inclined to contemplation. And so the better thing for them to do is to work more. Okay? But learning is what it's all about in Moore's system, improving your mind. And that just shows you what his values are, right? What he values, what he enjoys, what he thinks is important. Right? And he wants a society that will allow the average person, very different from his own time, instead of just the wealthy, to have the leisure to improve themselves, to educate themselves, and to continue to make themselves more refined.
A little bit off subject, but did you say there's no curfew?
Well, something rings a bell with a curfew. I think there is potentially a curfew. I don't remember seeing that word, but he talks about there's a time when people go to bed. Okay, so I think that there's at the very least a social expectation that you won't be up all night. But did you have something in mind? Or?
Well, I'm just curious because a lot of people say
Right. Yeah, that wouldn't work too well. It doesn't work too well, but like I said, I mean, do any of you remember a mention of alcohol in Utopia? Because I don't. Yeah.
It says at the beginning of the book that it seems like he's against it. He doesn't mention anything to Utopian society.
Right, in Utopian society, there's no alcohol, it would seem. He doesn't make a big point of it, but yeah, I think you're right. More is, among the other social evils that he would point to, alcoholism would be one of them. And, lots of times people in desperate straits, when they get some money, do go and drink, right? Because life is not good, life is miserable, and a lot of poor people don't think they can ever accumulate anything, right? I mean, no savings that they could possibly really change their life with. So it's, sort of almost a rational choice from a certain perspective when you live this way to just go and have a drink. Makes you feel better for a while. Yeah.
We really have a promise based on the reading. I mean, it's obviously, there's probably a few things we're reading on serious philosophy, another, literature books we're reading based on personal benefit. I'm sure a lot of people in company that's the idea that, Harry Potter, for example, would be, encouraged to better somebody.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, would there be any restrictions placed on?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, your general sense in reading this is that Moore wants to steer people away from whatever is sort of pedestrian or tawdry. Like he says about game playing, no dice, no cards, no gambling, right? So I think he would make a distinction between philosophy and literature, as he puts it, literature here, okay? And, trashy novels or, so there would be an attempt to steer people towards literature that's good. And I would suspect, I don't recall him saying that that direct censorship, using that term, but just the way that he deals with information coming into Utopia generally, that there would be a ban on certain types of material. And remember, they have their own scholars who produce literature. He also mentions at a certain point that they must have access to the Greek literature, so Greek philosophy, and comedy and tragedy and things like that they might have access to, okay? But I think he very much wants to channel people's activity in a higher direction. So, this type of thing bothers us because we're very dedicated to the First Amendment, Americans in particular. Freedom to be able to say what you want to say and read what you want to read, and generally to consume whatever information you want to consume is considered sacred, literally, really, to Americans. So any suggestion that people might not be allowed to read the trashy, romance novel or whatever, I would think that bothers some people. Even though most of us would at least say that we don't read trashy romance novels, we would want people to have a right to read them. So, and you have to ask yourself, in general, what's the problem with this type of system? Why is it that people feel uncomfortable with it? Okay? Well, because somebody has to decide what is good for us and what is not good for us under this type of system, right? Instead of we as individuals deciding, the people in charge of the society are deciding. That's the way it has to be. Okay? So I think this is what makes people uncomfortable. But his general point here is, if you work the society in this way, okay, with efficiency in mind, then people will only have to work so hard, way less hard than they would have to do in the England of his day. And therefore, they would have time to improve themselves in ways that most of the poor would have never been able to do in England. Okay. So, some of these points I've already made. See, that's the problem with PowerPoint. But I wanted to point to one more passage on page 35 that goes more into this point about the contrast between England and Utopia. This is great. So if you have your book, do mark it or make a note of it. About 1 inch down on page 35, he says, "And this you will easily apprehend if you consider how great a part of all other nations is quite idle." Okay? So a great section of other nations is idle, is not working. Okay? First, now this isn't going to please people, okay? Women generally do little, who are the half of mankind. And if some few women are diligent, their husbands are idle. Okay? So, interesting, huh? I mean, in some ways old-fashioned, but he's saying, this model of women being taken care of or staying at home and only raising their children is not good enough, basically. Okay? He calls that still being idle. So he wants them to be fully employed. And then he says, consider the great company of idle priests and of those that are called religious men. So priests, ministers, okay? Now, he's being critical of the priests of his own time, many of whom he saw as not doing enough to help the poor, for instance, and maybe not doing enough in general of their priestly duties. Add to these all rich men. So rich men are number 3, all right? He got the women and the priests first. Now, add to all these the rich men, chiefly those that have estates in land, who are called noblemen and gentlemen, together with their families, made up of idle persons that are kept more for show than use. Whole families of people living in mansions, doing next to nothing, just enjoying life, going hunting, playing games, and other people doing all the work to maintain them. All right, so all these people are idle. They produce nothing that benefits the rest of society. And he says then, and this won't make you happy, this is kind of weird to hear to us, but he says, add to these all those strong and lusty beggars that go about pretending some disease, an excuse for their begging. Okay? So there's some folks out there who are faking their neediness, all right, in his view, and are living off of people's alms, but they really are capable of going out and working. Okay? So we have to add those in too. And upon the whole account, you will find that the number of those by whose labor mankind is supplied is much less than you perhaps imagined. Then consider how few of those that work are employed in labors that are of real service. For we who measure all things by money give rise to many trades that are both vain and superfluous, and serve only support riot and luxury. Okay? So we've got this smaller group of people doing most of the labor in the society. And then a good chunk of that number of people are producing things that only benefit the luxurious life of a few. Okay, that's the point he's making. So all the servants and employees of these big households, who really just, to concentrate on serving the family and the children of these very few people. Or all these people that produce the jewelry and the fine clothes that these folks wear are employed, in his view, in occupations that benefit only a very few and keep their labor from benefiting the rest of mankind. For, he says, if those who work were employed only in such things as the conveniences of life require, there would be such an abundance of them that the price of them would so sink that tradesmen could not be maintained by their gains. Okay? Now, does he have a point there? Does he have a point that an awful lot of labor is, that, first of all, a lot of people don't work as much as they could, and that a lot of what is done is directed at things that people don't absolutely, as he says, require, but that people just want? I mean, now we live in the so-called consumer society, right? Where we get all kinds of things that you could argue we don't need. So I think that this is not an outmoded point of view. I've heard it expressed. I hear it expressed every week by critics of the type of economy that we have, where people buy things like huge TVs, that they stick on their wall half the size of this screen here. Do they really need it? We have, thousands of people employed in making those types of things. Millions of people. So, now what's the answer to that criticism, by the way? Does anybody have an answer to that criticism that our type of economic system employs an awful lot of useless labor involved in making things that people don't need? Is there an answer to that criticism? Yes, it's making jobs, right? And then those jobs give them income. They can go out and buy the things that they need. Okay?
We already produce all of the things that we need in such so much that it would be pointless for everybody to be operating certain things.
Yeah. Right. We have an economy that produces what people need for the most part. Now, everything in this regard is relative. We have poverty today, but the poverty of today compared to the experience of poverty then is different in this country. Very similar in some other countries. Okay? But in this country, our poor live better than 90% of the folks that, occupy London. So we can at least supply them with the necessities of life. And people don't have to starve in America. However, as I say, it's relative, and people can be unsatisfied and still be critical of how we direct the resources that we have.
It's kind of different than what we're talking about, but I find it interesting that there's a goal for everyone to kind of be in the same and work for the same thing, but yet their religion isn't the same. They don't have a state religion.
Right, there's no one religion.
Very diverse in people, and that's such a controversial issue anyway that has separated people throughout history. But yet he allows that to be one diverse point that people can kind of have.
Yeah, it is interesting. We'll have to talk about that, about the different beliefs that they have. He seems to treat all the religious beliefs as basically compatible, or being able to coexist easily with each other. But of course, in European experience, different beliefs were not seen by people as compatible. It does raise the question with the fact that people are allowed to believe different things in Utopia lead to these differences and conflicts. So I think that's a good point. But anyway, something to think about as far as his criticism. I guess the answer that you guys have been aiming at is that this is a type of system where, yes, we do produce a lot of things that people don't absolutely need, and there's a lot of consuming of stuff that's disposable and so forth. But yet, overall, the average wealth has increased. Not necessarily when you look at the last 50 years or 25 years, but if you look at the last 300 or 400 years, okay, it's definitely done so. Okay? And because of that, we'll accept the evils in order to obtain what is good. The good for all is increased standard of living and so forth, would be at least one answer to that objection. It's John Locke's answer to that objection, for instance. So I just want to point to a similarity with Marx, and that is that Marx too believed that the capitalist economy was supremely irrational. When you grow up in a capitalist economy, you're taught that it's very rational. Everybody pursues their own self-interest, and through the invisible hand, Adam Smith's invisible hand, that the working out of individual self-interest works generally to the benefit of all. Things are made that people want to buy. Buying them produces jobs, and people are taken care of by the system without anyone being in charge and directing the economy. Okay? Supply and demand. But Marx said capitalism doesn't always work that way. Okay? Capitalism produces recessions and depressions. There's crises that happen within capitalism, and sometimes he called these crises of overproduction. They aren't always produced by overproduction. They can be produced by tightened credit and so forth. But anyway, Marx noticed that capitalism wasn't always onward and upward. During Marx's time of the Industrial Revolution, it had produced a great deal of poverty. It didn't seem to be working well. And he believed that it was irrational because no one was in charge. Okay? What we're sort of comfortable with creates for socialists a great deal of discomfort. How can you have an economic system that's good for everybody, when nobody's controlling it. Okay? In order to apply rationality to the system, you have to have control. So for them, this is just easy. It's an easy, no-brainer. Okay? You can't have a system that is ultimately efficient if there isn't a human being or human beings in charge of deciding what is needed, how much of it should be produced, where it should go. Okay? It's a very different way of viewing the economy and of viewing a goal of efficiency. All right? So for Marx and More, rational planning was key, and with it would come abundance, material abundance and equality. People would have what they need. Mm-hmm.
If they're going to argue that like a capitalist society would be irrational, how would they say that putting one or two people in charge of everything would be any more rational? Because if people are irrational, how can they entrust the power of the entire society to one or two people? How would that work?
Right. Well, that's especially Moore's problem, because he really does entrust the economy to a small group of people. Okay, the leadership is going to decide, what's made and what people need and so forth. And you have a great point, and this is the point of a liberal thinker such as John Locke, our founding fathers. They basically said, you don't want to put those decisions in the hands of any group of individuals. You want those decisions in everybody's hands, because as soon as they're in the hands of a small group of individuals, they will likely use their power to enrich themselves, to empower themselves, to make themselves indispensable. They'll abuse it, in other words. So there's an assumption on the part of thinkers such as the American founders that people will abuse whatever power you give them. And that's why you have to build up a system that takes that into account and in various ways prevents it from happening. Whereas More is really thinking, this is why I class him as a history as progress thinker, even though he's not like Marx, he's not a determinist, but he really seems to think that there will be a time when people will think differently, okay? And they'll think differently enough that you could place decision-making control in the hands of some people, and they would do the right thing, okay? Because they would see it as in their interest and in everybody's interest to do that. And Marx believes that in the communist system, when it comes time for the communist system, people's mentality will have changed. He believed that the capitalist mentality wasn't natural. It was the product of capitalist circumstances. The assumptions that people were raised in and brought to believe were absolutely always true. They're not really absolutely always true. We could be changed by change in socialization, change in the environment in which we're brought up and in which we work. Okay? So it's just a very different view of human nature, too. Okay? Because I tend to agree with you. I don't want to decide to put that power. As messy as the capitalist economy can sometimes be, I think it would be worse if we gave that type of economic power to any set of planners. I don't care who they are, whether they're university professors or, government bureaucrats or whoever it is. Once they got that power, I think it's natural for people to ask, how can I improve my situation? How can I help my family and my friends? Okay? And not everybody. But I'm a cynic about these things. So, but these guys really believe in the power of socialization and the flexibility of human nature. Human beings can become more than they are now, better than they are now. Okay, well now let's get to religion. Ben made the point about religion. There's different ones, and you would think that More would have learned from the religious conflict in Europe that people disagree vehemently about religion, and this creates negative distinctions amongst them, and they fight about it. But More proposes a society where there are various religious beliefs tolerated, allowed, okay? And it sounds as though people are able to have mutual respect for them. He says, down at the bottom of page 47, these are their religious principles, that the soul of man is immortal. So these are the things that they all hold in common. The soul of man is immortal, that God of his goodness has designed that it should be happy, that he has therefore appointed rewards for good and virtuous actions and punishments for vice to be distributed after this life. Okay? So, despite the fact that some believe in, one God, some believe in sort of spiritual world of nature, there's various degrees in between, they all agree God exists, that the soul of man is immortal, and that when you die, you're either rewarded or punished based upon your behavior. Okay? Remember Plato in the Gorgias, in that myth at the end of the Gorgias, he has the same sort of point about the myth. It's not a myth that he believes in its details absolutely, but in all of his myths, he always has reward and punishment as a part of it. Okay? So it leads you to wonder, is there a way that people can generally conduct themselves well if they don't have some sort of, apprehension of cosmic justice, if they aren't worried about that, judgment that may come to them in the next life? More seem to think that was essential. And then he says, though these principles of religion are conveyed down among them by tradition, they think that even reason itself determines a man to believe and acknowledge them, and freely confess that if these were taken away, no man would be so insensible as to not seek after pleasure by all possible means, lawful or unlawful. So he really thinks without at least believing these things, people would be hedonists. They would not have the self-control necessary to live in this type of system. So people understand through reason itself, using reason itself, that these beliefs are, what people need, that they are reasonable. Okay? So that's a very different perspective, albeit he does, and we'll talk more about this, but he does allow for various beliefs. And Catholicism isn't one, because, they don't know about Catholicism until these people show up on their island. But he seems to think the overall effect of religion is definitely good. Okay? Definitely good. It trains people to think morally. It makes them fear if they commit wrongdoing. Okay? Now, that's very different from the way Marx views religion, just to kind of, most of you know this already, but Marx is famous for calling religion the opiate of the masses. Okay? And generally speaking, what Marx believed, and he got this from a thinker named Feuerbach, among others, who's interested in human psychology and sociology. And we will talk all about that. But he got this idea that human beings created God, a sort of psychological construct. They created God in order to handle the difficulties and the trials of their lives, okay? In order to be able to cope with poverty or with death itself, with the fear of death. Okay? So if you place them in a very different situation, Marx believed the belief of God no longer be needed. Okay? You wouldn't need it because you wouldn't need a sort of pacifier to keep you sane in a difficult world. You would have what you needed. Okay? So Marx is an atheist, and he believed that religion basically supported oppression. Oppression and religion go hand in hand. Religion is needed because of oppression. So when you get rid of oppression, no need for religion. The communist utopia then of Marx, shouldn't have used that term, the communist society of Marx, would be atheistic. No need for belief in religion. So they're very different there. More believes in order for people to have the self-control and to direct their minds in the right direction and actually have the system work, they have to believe in God. Okay? And Marx believes the belief in God is a sort of side effect of oppression. So, it won't be needed, and it's counterproductive. When people let go of religion, Marx believes, then they will be able to fully fix the problems that they have, because they won't be looking to somebody else to solve the problems for them. Okay. Any questions so far? I've talked for a while without asking you, so. Yeah.
I think that's the big reason why Marxist communism will never work, is because as long as you give absolute power to a few people who don't have to answer to anybody else who loves them, they're going to be corrupted every single time.
In real life,
I know more reform is going to work a whole lot better, but it at least has a chance because the people have to answer to some higher being within
Well, there's that, and there's also the voluntary nature of it. You know, you get the sense that if people want to leave Utopia, they can. Nobody who doesn't want to live this way is really going to want to stay and is not welcome there. So there's no sense that they're forcing people to stay, okay? I liken it more to like a voluntary commune, you know, and some people live in these situations. Jewish people in Israel can choose to live in a kibbutz, you know, and if they do, they share everything in common and they live with their religious principles, all right, very strong in their lives, and they're quite happy doing that. But they know they don't. It's a choice. They don't have to live that way. They can leave anytime they want to. That may make all the difference in the world. Now, with Karl Marx, as you'll see, didn't believe himself that people would have to be forced to live this way. In real life, in actual communist events that happened in the world, that's exactly what happened. Okay, so one might say, based upon the evidence, Karl Marx was wrong about human nature, or maybe he was wrong about how such revolutions might happen, and we'll have to talk about that. But he did not envision a system where people would have to be forced to live this way. He thought that a transformation would happen, and with that transformation, people would want to live this way. This would be their choice. And he also didn't think that a small number of people would have to control the economy. It would be controlled by the planning of many people. But that's not the way it worked out either. In effect, you know, Marxism was embraced by leaders who definitely wanted to have a few people control the economy. And it did create for them this great power source that they then wielded over people, you know, to force them to live a certain way. So for Marx, there's a huge difference between, not complete difference, but there's quite a difference between his theory and the actual practice of communism. There's still a link between the two, most definitely, but there's a difference, because if he looked at the communism that exists, say, or that used to exist in the Soviet Union, okay, Marx would have to say, you know, people are being thrown into jail, they're being forced to work, you know, the economy is being used to enrich some people more than others, and there's a lot of political corruption. He couldn't have completely supported such a system. I don't think so. In fact, Marx predicted that politics would cease to exist in communism, which means that no one would use their position to wield any sort of authority over anyone else. Okay? Obviously, that didn't happen. So, yeah. Any other questions or comments so far? Yeah.
It seems to me like this kind of stuff does seem to work, at least in certain cases, on a smaller scale.
Mm-hmm.
And is it really possible for it to work on a scale of society?
Yeah. I think that's a problem. I think that now that we've seen so many different experiments take place and we can look at the history of them, it's quite clear that when you try to impose this on an entire country, that's when it becomes next to impossible to do right. You know, because the power is used wrongly in a corrupt way by people who are actually in charge. The larger the number of people, the more need there will be for leaders. It's hard for large groups of people to accomplish anything in a concerted way without leaders. And as soon as you have leaders in positions of authority, you have the risk of corruption. And in every case, in a communist country, that's exactly what's happened. You know, Cuba, small example. Okay, but what happens? You know, Fidel Castro finally gets way too ill to rule, after basically ruling as a vegetable for a year. Okay, and then who gets power? Raul, his brother. Okay. Now, you know, that's not the way communist government is supposed to be run, in theory, but it certainly is the way it's run in practice. The leader who's about to die or who dies has selected whoever is going to come after him so that the control can be maintained. So, but you know, if people voluntarily choose to live this way, another example is the monasteries, religious communities, okay? Monks and religious who live this way. They don't own anything. They work together and they're quite happy. The Amish, right, would be another example. They really kind of shun the outside world. They want to live exactly the way they do, and they don't treat property as private property. So I think it is quite possible for people to choose to live this way. And when it's their choice, and they can leave whenever they want to, that maintains the purity of the system. Because everybody has an incentive to keep it in a way that people will continue to choose it. Right? So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Okay. Does anybody else want to say anything? I thought I heard a voice up there in the back. Okay. Well, just a couple more slides here. I talked a little bit about the political organization before. It's very complex, okay? And if I can't remember the details of it, I'm not going to expect you to remember the details of it. All these different names of leaders and so forth. But, I mean, the central thing to remember is that More is trying to devise a system in which there is no one or two people in charge, okay? There's some democratic elements. The cities elect representatives to a national assembly, okay? There's also a sort of, he's not a hereditary prince, but a prince for life, sort of the next best thing, somebody who holds that position for as long as they are able to in good standing without abusing it, okay, until they die. There's a priesthood, a group of educated men who are involved in making decisions about selecting the prince and selecting other leaders, okay? So there's a variety of sources of power, and perhaps that's where More gets a little bit realistic, realizing that you can't place all the responsibility in the hands of the prince, for instance. It's dispersed, all right? And also there's checks on the majority, and one of those checks is an attempt to sort of correct what the ancient Greeks suffered from, the instant decision, okay? Where, they just somebody made an eloquent speech and they said, yeah, let's go to war, and the decision was made. They have to wait a day and really contemplate what they've heard before they make a decision, which isn't a great check, but at least it's some notion that people can be rash and can need to be encouraged to actually think about what they're doing. All right, now, one of the things I wanted to do is talk about ways in which More's ideas are Platonic, because I'm sure that it occurred to some of you that, in fact, the video pointed this out. There are some ways in which More's Utopia is similar to Plato's Republic in particular. They're both utopian societies. They're planned by an intellectual, supposedly on the basis of what will work out best for the society as a whole. Certainly, one of the Platonic elements in More's book is his anti-materialism. Plato, I can say without a doubt, was anti-materialistic. He believed that what was real was the human mind, the ideas that could be explored by the human mind. What is eternal is real for Plato. Okay? Not the things that we work with and the things that we do day in and day out to survive. Okay? Now, More wants to express his anti-materialism in a lot of ways, but when he talks about avoiding waste, about not making distinctions based on building and clothing or jewelry, and when he expresses contempt for riches, he's expressing his anti-materialism. And when he points people in the direction of reading, or says that, the contemplative life is better than the life of labor, he's expressing anti-materialism. Plato would agree. Okay? The contemplative life is superior to the life of physical labor. Both are worthy, and we need physical labor, and neither one of them would encourage exploiting it or faulting it or criticizing it. Okay? But still, both of them clearly think that the life of learning is the better choice if a person is capable of doing it. So both of them are right there. Okay? And I think that More was directly inspired by Platonic philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy, quite obviously, okay, in this regard. You have to make concessions to the world because you have to eat and you have to clothe yourself, and these things are necessary, but what's it all for? So that you can go to lectures, and so that you can read, and so that you can think and become, more knowledgeable. All right? So, there is this emphasis on learning as the chief pleasure, also shared by Confucius, right? So in this way, he's very much in the idealistic vein, all right? And I just put up this quote, and I'll stop here, but I want to read you this quote, and I want to ask you, how similar, could Plato have written this? Very same idea. He says, More says, if any man imagines that there is a real happiness in physical enjoyments, he must then confess that he would be the happiest of all men if he were to lead his life in perpetual hunger, thirst, and itching, and by consequence in perpetual eating, drinking, and scratching himself, which anyone may easily see would not only be a base but a miserable state of life. These are indeed the lowest of pleasures, the least pure, for we can never relish them but when they are mixed with the contrary pains. Remember in the Gorgias, when he talks about how the greatest pleasure from eating comes when you're hungry. You have a pain and a pleasure that exist at the same time. Why is it pleasurable to drink? Because you're thirsty. You have that mixed pleasure. When it comes to physical pleasures, they're always mixed with pain. That's a very Platonic idea. The only type of pleasure which Plato believed was unmixed with pain was intellectual pleasure. Okay? And that's why he preferred it. It made sense to him, and I think it makes sense to More as well. These are words that, it's almost like he lifted them from a Platonic dialogue. Okay? So anyway, when we come back, we'll look at some more ways in which they're similar or different. We'll talk about slavery and finish up the book.